Good afternoon. I apologize for the delay, but thank you all for being here today as the subcommittee conducts this important oversight hearing. In fiscal year 2021, VA ranked fourth among federal agencies in procurement dollars, obligated at $34.3 billion, and second in number of contact actions at $1.8 million. To put it simply, the VA buys a lot of stuff, from personal protective equipment to pharmaceutical drugs, hearing aids, and much more. VA's mission to care for our veterans comes with tremendous purchasing power. Congress and both this administration and the Trump administration made it a priority to ensure the federal government is buying American-made products to the greatest extent possible. Buying from manufacturers in Virginia's 2nd Congressional District, Indiana's 1st District, Mr. Mervan's district, and every other district in America not only supports American workers, but makes VA's supply chain more secure. As we saw during the COVID pandemic, a large percentage of medical supplies are manufactured overseas, and VA is extremely vulnerable to shortages if global supply chains are interrupted. We can't afford to ignore this glaring weakness. In response, Congress passed the Make PPE in America Act, which changed how the VA buys PPE by requiring the VA to buy from domestic manufacturers on a minimum 2-year contract. I'm concerned that a year and a half after this law was enacted, there appears to be very little that has changed. I understand that new legislation takes time to implement, but issues at VA don't normally get better with time. A recent Inspector General report highlighted significant issues with VA's compliance with decades-old Made in America laws. I recently heard from industry leaders that as of a few months ago, the VA didn't even seem to have a plan to implement the law, which is concerning. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses on what progress the VA has made in the past 18 months and what we can expect going forward, because American companies and veterans they hope to serve don't have decades to wait. Many American companies have overhauled their production lines to meet VA's demand for world-class goods and supplies. The VA must similarly change their procurement process to step up their outreach and market research to identify opportunities to work with American companies. I'm concerned many of these companies will be forced to close down their operations if the VA doesn't immediately follow the law and take a more proactive approach to buying American. That being said, I know that there are occasions when the VA needs to buy critical supplies from outside our borders. The VA has many waivers and exceptions at their disposal. If the VA is unable to buy the materials they need from domestic manufacturers quickly and at a reasonable price, they can use these waivers. Waivers are stopgaps that allow VA to serve veterans even when American supplies aren't available. I support having waivers as an option because even when supply chains fail, veterans must come first. While I have no issue with the VA using waivers, I'm concerned that reports show they are sometimes a crutch for VA bureaucrats to cut corners rather than buy American. The waiver process needs to be transparent so the public can be confident that VA is following the law and buying quality American supplies whenever possible. Waivers must also be limited so American companies can invest with the confidence that VA will buy domestic from domestic sources whenever it's practical, not just when it's convenient. I would also like to note my concern over our reliance on foreign manufactured pharmaceuticals, especially those made in China. As a nurse practitioner, I know firsthand that many Americans, especially our older population, relies on life-saving drugs. VA alone cannot fix this issue, but I look forward to hearing how the VA intends to help incentivize onshoring pharmaceuticals and solving this dangerous situation. Ultimately, as the chair of the oversight arm of this committee, it's my job to ensure that the VA is spending its procurement dollars wisely and in compliance with Made in America laws. I take this matter seriously, and I trust the witnesses do as well. With that, I now recognize Ranking Member Mervan for his opening comments.
Thank you, Chair Kiggins. The importance and impact of Buy America for the federal government is something that is felt at a very local level in Indiana. It is because of these laws, which were reinforced by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, that we can advocate for the use of the American steel in federal infrastructure projects. This impacts the lives and livelihoods of many Americans across the country. President Biden has made investing in our manufacturing base and strengthening our supply chains a priority during his administration. The creation of the Made in America office, which was codified by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, provides a central clearinghouse to ensure that the billions of dollars spent for goods and services by the federal government each year take into account investments in American industry. The administration, as well as the committee, understand that we must learn the lessons of the pandemic and ensure that critical supplies like PPE have a domestic manufacturing base. Relying on foreign products in a time of crisis is a flawed strategy that unfortunately was felt directly by the VA employees and veterans. This requires a concerted effort across VA to comply with the laws and the presidential directives in place to provide opportunities for American companies to provide personal protective equipment and other supplies. Without a consistent demand for these products, we cannot ensure that American companies will be around for the next crisis. As I've discovered since joining this committee, VA has had significant issues and hurdles surrounding the purchase and tracking of supplies. The continued overuse and reliance on purchase cards at medical centers hinders VA's ability to track whether supplies purchased are American-made and provide zero insight on a national level to the needs and requirements of medical centers so that VA can use its purchasing power to gain cost efficiencies. The continued use of purchase cards also means that medical centers are also not making use of the large medical surgical prime vendor contracts and blanket purchase agreements. These contracts are in place for the benefit of the medical centers and provide greater accountability and insight into the medical centers and veterans' needs. I realize VA is doing their best to change course on this, but I'd like to know how Congress can support this effort. We need this data for VA to ensure we are purchasing American products and to assist our oversight. Because of the decades of lack of emphasis on domestic manufacturing, this endeavor that I strongly support is a Herculean task. It's not often that both parties can agree that we need significant federal investment and coordination. That is, what will it take to make a dent in this issue? VA can't do it alone. It will require continued support from the White House and Congress to ensure we are investing in American manufacturing. With that, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mervan. We will now turn to witness testimony. Testifying before us today, we have Mr. Michael Parrish, Principal Executive Director of the Office of Acquisition, Logistics, and Construction, and Chief Acquisition Officer. And Dr. Angela Billups, the Executive Director of the Office of Acquisition, Logistics, and Construction, and Senior Procurement Executive. And Mr. Andrew Centenio, Executive Director for Procurement and Logistics from the Veterans Health Administration. And Dr. Thomas Emmendorfer, the Executive Director for the Pharmacy Benefits Management Service. Will all the witnesses please stand and raise your right hand, and we'll swear you guys in. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Parrish, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to provide your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kiggins. Good afternoon, Chairwoman Kiggins, Ranking Member Mervan, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to appear before you today to discuss the VA procurement and the Department's compliance with domestic preference rules such as Made in America that govern the purchase of goods and services from American sources. As stated, joining me today are my colleagues, Dr. Angela Billups, the Executive Director for the Office of Acquisition and Logistics and our Senior Procurement Executive, Mr. Andrew Centenio, our Executive Director for Procurement and Logistics from the Veterans Health Administration, and Dr. Thomas Emmendorfer, the Executive Director of Pharmacy Benefits Management Services, also from VHA. VA complies with the Buy America Act by following the standardized guidance in the federal and VA mandates. The Department works diligently to purchase goods made in America whenever possible, and we are committed to the full implementation of our statutory requirements. We are working in collaboration with other federal entities as well as industry to identify U.S.-made products and to support the rebuilding of U.S. manufacturing capacity. As a result, the vast majority of what we purchase comes from domestic sources. As stated, the COVID-19 pandemic heightened awareness of our dependence on markets outside the United States for raw materials in the manufacture of certain products. This dependence is not just a VA problem, it's a national problem that's been decades in the making. Essential healthcare items such as personal protective equipment, or PPE, and pharmaceuticals are two examples where U.S. dependency on foreign markets over the years has actually increased, in addition to the known information technology challenges. Nonetheless, VA is committed to working with other federal agencies to communicate to industry the importance of domestically produced products, as well as to identify American-made products and support the rebuilding of the United States manufacturing capacity. In those instances when VA is unable to buy American-made products, we carefully follow the rules and regulations and have established procedures for requesting a waiver or applying an exemption. I personally review each of these requests. For example, in FY23, VA has requested and received 52 waivers, 23 of which are for pharmaceutical purchases via our mail-order pharmacy program. This is just over $9 million in total spend for pharmaceuticals with approved waivers for this fiscal year. As VA is projected to spend $5.1 billion on pharmaceuticals, the approved waivers represent approximately 0.2% of the total pharmaceutical finished product spend for our mail-order pharmacy program. It's important to note that these foreign purchases are our last resort, as you stated. We only approve them because they're in the best interest of the veterans and we can't find an American source. But these products are always FDA approved and commercially available. VA is continuously engaged in efforts to increase opportunities to purchase domestically manufactured products. Many drugs, for example, require ingredients that come from or manufactured in markets outside the United States. With the veterans' healthcare needs as our priority, it's not always possible to obtain the required medication from a domestic source. The Food and Drug Administration Office of Pharmaceutical Quality's most recent annual report states that only 42% of pharmaceutical manufacturing sites are U.S.-based, with the rest of the world accounting for 58%. However, compliance is not enough, and neither is the status quo. We're on offense when it comes to Made in America compliance. We're proactively increasing our outreach efforts and partnerships with American industry, resulting in invaluable industry insights on the domestic availability of products, market trends, best practices, and innovations. Our Pathfinder tool that you may be aware of, pathfinder.va.gov, is one method of capturing this market data. Another example is VA is piloting a program to find domestically manufactured drug products. VA also remains committed to exploring and supporting with our industry partners all opportunities to make PPE in America. The journey requires support beyond the federal healthcare space of VA to achieve that goal, while maintaining supply chain resiliency and to reduce dependency on overseas markets for these PPE requirements. In April 2023, VA participated in a Make PPE in America Industry Day hosted by the Department of Health and Human Services. At that joint event, all federal agencies expressed their commitment to work towards full implementation of the Make PPE in America Act, with the end state of buying 100% of Made in America PPE. Unfortunately, in many circumstances, we found that certain inputs of PPE are not yet manufactured in the United States, as much of the raw materials are manufactured overseas. Our efforts also extend beyond PPE and pharmacy as we work in support of increasing the purchase and manufacture of all products made in America. Regarding infrastructure and the Buy America, Build America Act, to date we indeed have had only 2 waivers, and that's because we're complying with the law. We have incorporated construction clauses in all our contracts and are enforcing that American-made materials are used in all of our construction projects. Additionally, we are working closely with our interagency partners to address foreign-owned and controlled interests to identify and mitigate cybersecurity vulnerabilities, as well as potential threats to our supply chain and to protect our veterans' information, both personal and health data. As a chief acquisition officer and senior accountable official for the department, I'm a very strong proponent of purchasing products that are made in the United States, and I welcome all industry partners who can meet the FDA and Made in America compliance requirements. Additionally, we embrace the opportunity to continue to partner with you and your staff, as well as the White House, to improve our national manufacturing base. Our veterans deserve no less. Chairwoman Kiggins, Ranking Member Mervan, and members of the subcommittee, I agree with your concerns, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak about VA procurement and the opportunities to increase manufacturing production in the United States and to reduce our dependency on overseas markets for certain raw materials and finished products. My colleagues and I are pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Parrish. We will now move to questions, and I yield myself 5 minutes first. A September 2022 OIG report detailed issues with Buy American Act compliance at Regional Procurement Office Central. The report found that, quote, contracting officers did not always meet the intent and requirements of the Buy American Act because of insufficient oversight and training. The OIG found over half of sampled contracts and associated files contained evidence of noncompliance with the Buy American Act and associated laws, regulations, and policies. Dr. Billups, what has the VA done to correct this?
VA actually started working on the Buy American Act and trying to make some corrections because we actually received a similar finding in the 2018 timeframe from GAO. One of the, oh my goodness, I forgot to turn my mic on. And one of the things that we did at that time, we established some new training. In addition to establishing the new training, we did a stand-down day to say 100% of the workforce needed to attend the training, and the BAA was part of that training at that time. But some of the things that we also did at the end of that going into 2020, we did a compliance review so that we could see how we were doing. And we did find that we were not doing as well as we had hoped to do. So you fast forward to 2021, when IIJA was passed, some of the things that we did then, we took all of the information that we had learned from the previous updating of the training, as well as helping people to understand what are the things they should do. We implemented some new guidance. We put some tools into the guidance so that they would know the things they needed to think about when they were making these purchases. In addition to that, and at the beginning of FY23, all of the information that we had learned, we established an innovation lab where there was participation across all of the buying activities. Everyone had to have a representative in that innovation lab so that we could all understand what are the problems, what are the things that we need to do. We implemented those things in the 2023 timeframe, and we're already scheduling a lessons learned as it relates to the Buy American Act, IIJA, the changes for FY24. The planning started for that in September, and of course we'll let the buyers get through the end of the fiscal year, and we will start that new innovation lab. Hopefully we'll learn something today that will also be useful for that purpose.
Great.
Ma'am.
Could you share some of what those lessons learned were? Do you have maybe a few top 3 or 4?
Some of them was that people just did not understand like in the Buy American Act itself. So much of a percentage of the materials, and those percentage of those materials have changed over the years now that there are emphasis on Buy American. So they didn't understand the difference between the manufacture in America and the component piece, and putting those two things together, they didn't really understand what they were looking at. Some of the other areas was sometimes people would look at the Trade Agreements Act and the Buy American Act, and there was some confusion between those two acts. Then you turn around and throw IIJA on top of that, which is a little different from even Buy American, and 100% components, 100% manufacturing. So we continuously reach out. I have my compliance group to just look at all of the different awards that we're making so that we can make sure we are following, and when we find there's a compliance issue, we immediately reach out to those heads of those contracting activities.
Some continuous training, it sounds like, and
Yes.
Oversight. So I'm glad to hear the VA is taking the issue seriously. However, the Make PPE in America Act went into effect 18 months ago and brought about significant changes to how we buy PPE. I'm concerned the VA's past issues complying with the Buy American Act don't bode well for the Make PPE in America Act implementation. So, Mr. Paris, has your office published any guidance on the Make PPE in America Act yet?
Ma'am, let me go back to, if I can respond also to your previous question, just other data points so you're aware is we've submitted for closure those open items to the OIG as far as the training, and we've also had ongoing training. As we said, we just had our nationwide, enterprise-wide acquisition workforce summit where Made in America training was reinforced, was retrained there. So when it comes to the PPE Made in America Act compliance, let me pass that off to Mr. Centennial, and he could talk more specifically about that.
So thank you for that question. Excuse me. So for Make in America, as was discussed earlier, in April we met with all of our federal partners. We engaged with industry. Over 600 participants were in the event with the federal and the industry partners that were there. We have continuous outreaches. We have biweekly engagements with those folks that are actually vendors, suppliers, and manufacturers with the VA. So we continue to have that outreach every 2 weeks with our programs that are within the Medical Surgical Prime Vendor Program, which was mentioned earlier. But then the larger purview is the PPE industry. In the PPE industry, we've got about 1,500 products for our product list that we are expanding to look at. we have inputted and we've asked for self-certification, which we have received. 109 products on our product list self-certified by vendors to say that they are 100% made in America. We continue to have an outreach every single time, and we let our folks know, if there's a product that's out there, please let us know, because we want to move in the direction where industry is so that we are absolutely compliant with that. And as was mentioned earlier in some of the opening remarks, this is a decades-long challenge, so industry realizes it, and they are leaning towards us the same way we are leaning to them to be partners in this.
My time has expired, so thank you very much. I would now yield to Ranking Member Mervan for his questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Parrish, as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Build America, Buy America Act reemphasizes the requirement for federal infrastructure to use domestically produced steel, which I am a huge proponent of. Can you explain to me, or to the committee, how you are overseeing the use of U.S. steel in all VA infrastructure projects?
Thank you for that question, sir. As I mentioned, we only have 2 waivers in place because we're mandating that the Made in America material requirements in particular are covered on all our construction projects. The way we do that is we have our resident engineers for the major construction projects are on site, and they validate the bill of materials, and they ensure that all the products that are coming into the system, to include steel, because I agree with you that it needs to be American-made steel, are indeed American-made. The other part that we have is we have a IDIQ contract, and we have 13 service-disabled, veteran-owned small businesses around the nation that handle our construction management services. And part of that independent review is also to make sure that we have a double check on ensuring that we're in compliance with the Buy America, Build America Act.
Okay. There's a current backlog for infrastructure projects at the VA, and I hope that Congress can put more of an emphasis on funding these requirements. They directly benefit veterans as well as domestic manufacturers. Mr. Parrish, are you aware of what the current backlog of infrastructure projects at the VA would cost?
Yes, sir. We have had significant discussions about infrastructure, where we're looking at the next coming years as being our year of infrastructure. And as you're well aware, that our facilities debt, if you will, the average age of our facilities are over 60 years old, when the average age of civilian hospitals are approximately 18. So we have a lot of challenges on maintaining and ensuring that we've properly sized and focus on the with PACT Act in particular, on where our veterans are moving to. So I am aware, and I believe that we have other presentations for you at different dates for that.
Okay. And then my follow-up question, do you know how much the VA has appropriated for infrastructure projects in fiscal year 23?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but I can find out for you, sir.
Okay. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kiggins, Ranking Member Mervan, for holding this hearing today. This is an issue which is very important to my home district. The administration's overuse of exemptions harms local economies like American Samoa's fishing and canning industry. We are in direct competition with foreign processors who underpay their workers and have lower standards for illegal and unreported fishing. This not only harms our economy and the environment, but a lack of support for American industry and self-sufficiency opens us up to national security concerns. Unscrupulous actors such as China, who do not have the same commitment to quality and safety as the U.S., will capitalize on every bit of business we cede to other countries, be that directly or indirectly. Our agenda today focuses on VA procurement, but the importance of upholding the Buy American Act across the board cannot be understated. These questions are for any of the VA witnesses. Roughly how many non-availability waivers has VA granted since EO 14005 was issued in January 2021?
I did mention in my hearing, ma'am, that for the year, we've had 52 waivers. The full since 2021, I don't know if we have, we'll have to take that for action and get you information.
And what types of products has VA historically requested non-availability waivers for? Excuse me.
Sure. Since they come to me personally, like I said, I review every single one of the packets, and it gets through a rigorous process through Dr. Billus's organization and mine. And it's always started, as I say, acquisition's a team sport, so those requirements start at the clinical level and are clinically driven for how we serve our veterans. Half of them, or majority of them, are pharmaceutical, as I mentioned in my initial address, but also we have quite a few of medical devices that we have come through.
Okay, anybody else want to jump in? What steps has VA taken to identify domestic producers of these types of products, and what groups have you worked with? This is for any of the witnesses.
Sure, I mentioned mine, so I'll pass it off to, let me start with Mr. Centennial, and he can talk about what we're doing with medical, and maybe pass it off to Mr. Emmendorfer for pharma.
Sure. We have continuous outreaches. We have one of the great partners that we have is a Coalition for Government Procurement, a major non-partisan group that meets with us, and it is small and large businesses, and we engage with them continually. So we get feedback from them because of the fact that they have a large market share of the medical supply business, both supplies and equipment. So we are able to have those engagements with that particular group. But then we also do it with, as I mentioned earlier, for our medical supply program, and that is a continual process as we move towards our next generation of our medical surgical prime vendor. And I'll pass it to Tom.
Thank you for the question. So we do have a pilot that was initiated as a joint federal initiative with the White House and the Made in America office. And we selected 2 drugs from the Food and Drug Administration's Drug and Biologic Essential Medicines, medical countermeasures, and critical inputs for the list described in Section 3 of the Executive Order 13944. The 2 drugs that we selected were atropine injection and hydralazine injection. The reason that we selected those drugs is because they are injectable drugs, have been known to be prone to drug shortages. And so we have developed those clinical requirements and giving a preference towards domestic manufacture. The reason that we just started with 2 for the pilot is when you look at the Food and Drug Administration Center for Drug Evaluation and Research report on the state of pharmaceutical quality, they estimate that 52% of the essential medicines are completely reliant on foreign manufacturing sites. So that means that we're really VA. We're trying, but we also are moving at the speed of industry. And when you look at the report, about 8% of the essential medicines, the critical input, the active pharmaceutical ingredient that makes up the final drug dosage form, those are made solely domestically. And then when you look at the manufacturing of the final dosage form, that goes up to about 18% being available completely domestically. So if the pilot's successful, we'll definitely look at expanding it.
And I'll also add, Congresswoman, that we work very collaboratively with the Made in America office and the White House, along with our other partners, both industry and other federal agencies. And the other thing, because I am actively pursuing American products, and as I mentioned in my original testimony, that some of the concerns is there are some American manufacturers, but they're not fully through the FDA approval process, and I think that's something that we can help them with, or all of us as government can help with. The other part is, as I mentioned, Pathfinder. We created this tool mainly to be able to capture new manufacturers, new vendors for us. And we've to date had about 1,000 submissions that have helped us identify people that could actually produce the products for us as needed.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Radewagen. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pappas for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And this subcommittee has had several hearings over the last few years on supply chain modernization. There were concerns before the pandemic when VA acquisition was added to the high-risk list. There were certainly serious concerns during the pandemic when we saw widespread disruptions to the availability of the supplies that VA needed. And obviously since, as efforts to modernization unfortunately haven't moved forward as quickly as many on this committee would like. But we thank you for your work and your commitment to getting this right. I am hearing issues from veteran-owned small businesses around this matter where medical centers are continuing to use purchase cards rather than some of the already competed tools, MSPV and blanket purchase agreement vehicles. So I think this presents a real challenge for us to be able to track purchases and know exactly what we're buying and how we're buying American-made products wherever possible. So I was wondering if the panel could answer that question around the purchase cards and what it will take to change things at VA to get away from this or to have better transparency into what we're actually purchasing with these cards.
Yes, thank you for that question, Congressman Pappas. And as you know, our supply chain modernization solicitation is ongoing, and one of our known gaps, as you're well aware, when we started the supply chain modernization effort, is our lack of enterprise visibility into inventory management, and inclusive of the Made in America aspect. And you'll note that the 4 key deliverables, as a reminder of the supply chain modernization effort, is enterprise visibility of inventory, so across all systems. It's also enterprise visibility of asset management, which is our capital equipment as well as our facilities. Enterprise visibility of order management, and that gets to like how are we buying things. And then the final one is this enterprise visibility supply chain risk management. I glanced over the idea of the foreign owned controlled interest concerns, and so for everyone's awareness, is the way the foreign actors are operating, they would come in and they would create a shell company, an American-made company that kind of perceives that they're American-made when they're truly owned by potentially bad actors. And so one of the big concerns that we have, and in that enterprise acquisition teaming effort that we're doing in the spirit of jointness and transparency in VA, is to make sure that all entities are well aware of what we're doing integrated. So we have the OIT team, our security team, our hospital staffs, all ensuring that if we're forced to have to buy some of these foreign products, that there is no way, shape, or form that they're able to touch our data or our systems. And so that's coming, and that piece we're working actively on a human basis, but with the supply chain modernization effort, the goal is to be able to see that proactively and not react to that. So I'm excited for the future, but it's going to take some time, probably another year or so before we get to that point.
Do you have a sense of how big a problem this is?
For PPE using credit cards, it's about 42 million. So it's not significant. It's a decent amount of money, and I personally, want to find a way and we're working across the processes to ensure that we're using best-in-class contracts, the category management, and other efforts. So it's a training effort, but it's also a way to ensure that our field is using the contracts. I think MSPV, the new medical surgical prime vendor contract, is in place. We have some enforcement mechanisms, as you know, with other kind of major programs to ensure that the distributor is able to deliver the products on time and on budget. Because one of the backups or the excuses I've heard is, hey, we've had problems with the distributor, so therefore we've got to use the credit card on an emergency buy. And we want to make sure that, and I believe the new contract is getting put in place, should be able to stop that or significantly reduce that. And we're focused on that effort.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your attention to that. I think it's a kind of a weak link here, and appreciate any additional information you can provide on it. I'm just curious, when it comes to workforce and having the acquisition workforce that we need to be able to deliver on Buy America and the host of other challenges that you face in VA, can you tell us where we are there and what Congress can do to support you? Is it just appropriations? Are there other things that you need to ensure that we can hire up and have the workforce that's well-trained and knowledgeable in these areas?
I think I'll take that for actually come back and see you with a more full-throated answer. But my personal view is I think that we, again, not just VA, but as we do have gaps and we do have resource constraints and have dependencies, unfortunately, on contract staff, I believe that the hiring process in federal government could be improved to help speed the ability to get people through the system. But we'll take that and come back to discuss that further with you, sir.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. And we'll go to round 2. I have a couple other questions, if any other members do as well. Let's see. Recently, I joined a domestic pharmaceutical manufacturing caucus that's bipartisan that we have here in Congress. I also was on even a panel this morning, healthcare panel. We were talking about some of the statistics of drugs that we import that are made in China. And from that panel, some of the statistics were pretty shocking that said, we import almost all of our over-the-counter pain medications from China, 70% of acetaminophen, 95% of ibuprofen. On top of that, 90% of prescription medications are made in China, including antidepressants, chemotherapy treatment for children and adults, medication for Alzheimer's, HIV, diabetes, Parkinson's, and epilepsy. And a recent U.S. Department of Commerce study found that 97% of all of our antibiotics come from China. So these are pretty shocking statistics. Would you say that the VA is aligned with these statistics, or what percentages? We're trying really hard to at least have the VA focus on Made in America pharmaceuticals. So what percentages, is it this high or is it different for the VA that relies on China for pharmaceutical drugs or components of those drugs?
I agree with your concerns, and it is a frustration for me personally. However, I'll pass the details off to Dr. Emmendorfer.
Yeah, I mean, definitely share your concerns, and thank you for the question. So with the contracting, we have to be compliant with the Trade Agreements Act. We do have cases where there's also another law, Public Law 102-585. So for your innovator drugs where there's not any generics available, there are cases where our contracting officer does need to make an award where it's coming from a country that is not compliant with the Trade Agreements Act. And that's really because we need to put the veterans first in their health care and their needs. But I do want to assure everyone that when VA is procuring drugs, we are procuring drugs that are approved for sale in the United States by the Food and Drug Administration. And the Food and Drug Administration has the overarching responsibility for ensuring that the manufacturing plants meet the quality standards to sell the drugs in this country, as well as meeting the safety and efficacy. So we do have some instances of drugs being on contract that are not compliant with the trade agreements.
Do we test them in this country randomly at any point to ensure that we're getting that quality product?
Thank you. That's another great question. So that responsibility, we're a healthcare system, so it's not our responsibility to be testing the end product. What that's being done is being done by our regulators, the Food and Drug Administration. So they are responsible for ensuring that the manufacturing plants meet current good manufacturing practices. And according to the one report that I referenced earlier, it does reference some of the sample and testing that the Food and Drug Administration does. But we as an agency do not.
Okay, so we'll make sure we get the FDA here next time. And then you mentioned in the pilot program for the pharmaceutical drugs that you had 2, I think, injectables that you were starting with. Is that, what preference are you prioritizing injectables, or what's kind of the rollout plan after those 2?
So we selected 2 injectables because injectables can be more prone to some shortages, as I'm sure you're aware with your background. And the reason that we selected those 2 is because they are on the FDA's essential medication list, so we have to start somewhere. So we're starting with those 2. We submitted the clinical requirements at the end of June, and now our acquisition staff they're working on the acquisition package. So we did give preference to domestic manufacturers. So for example, if the active pharmaceutical ingredient was sourced from this country and built in some of those. So, but we started with 2 drugs, and there's a list, I want to say, of about 186, so we had to start somewhere. So we picked 2.
And what's the next list down? Are you just going to stay in the injectable department, or is there?
I don't know. I think we just have to wait to see how what happens with this contract and make an assessment and analyze the results. And if we're able to make the award, try to determine through collaborative market research with our contracting officers where the next steps may take us.
Great. And then also, we know that many of the components of pharmaceuticals and medical devices are produced overseas, and the VA only represents a small portion of the market. But what would it take to truly reshore some of these pharmaceutical supply chains and medical device supply chains? What type of thing should Congress be focused on?
Yeah, I don't know that I can speak to that globally, but I did not provide the statistics on what part of the market share we represent, and that I can speak to. So our mail order pharmacy this year is going to spend about $5.1 billion. Our whole healthcare system as a whole spends right around $8 billion on pharmaceuticals. When you look at that into the context of what we spend in the United States for pharmaceuticals, that represents somewhere between 1% to 2%. So I think with that type of market share, that's why we're kind of reliant on the speed of the industry as well. I don't know that we have the market share to make any significant shifts in where corporations and manufacturers may decide to manufacture their drugs.
I'd like to just add a little bit to that question. to that response, and that is some of the things that we can do. A lot of times when you're looking at new areas that you kind of need to infuse industry, you really have to use other vehicles other than the federal acquisition regulation. When I was the SPE at HHS, it was something happening with antibiotics, and HHS has the authority to do OTAs, other transaction authority. And then that helped us at that time at HHS to have a cost sharing. Industry had their role, we had our role in the federal government, and we brought those things together, and we were able to get a result a lot faster than going through the processes that you have to go through with the federal acquisition regulation. So that's one of the things that Congress can do, is just to help us, and really just to understand the market that's out there now, because some of the guidance that we have and the way that we have to go about procuring things, it really doesn't help when you have the issues that we have in front of us that's impacting the entire country.
I hear you, so trying to marry it with the civilian sector a little bit
Yes.
better. Thank you very much, and my time has expired. I yield to Mr. Mervan for 5 minutes.
As I stated in my opening statement, our country has relied for decades on foreign production of supplies and goods, and I'm very pleased to see that President Biden has made it a core issue to ensure that we invest in American manufacturing. VA is a part of this, but can't do it on its own. Mr. Centennial, do you have any information on what the market share for VA and DoD for the purchase of medical supplies?
Thank you for that question. Yes, and in fact, I mentioned earlier, our partners, the Coalition for Government Procurement, just sent us some information indicating that the market share that the DoD and VA possess is somewhere between 2 to 3% of the total supply chain. So as was mentioned earlier, some of the conversation was we move at the speed of industry, and we are all leaning forward to get there. The challenge is going to be to make sure that we have the right energy to get industry to be postured to do that so we can all be successful.
And I guess one of the follow-up questions that I have, and the chairwoman alluded to it, but how is the private industry, along with you're moving at that same pace, is there a movement to onshore the production of pharmaceuticals here in the United States?
So, again, that's really outside of what we can control in VA on what industry is making decisions on manufacturing. But we are trying to make efforts within our agency by developing the clinical requirements and trying to give domestic preference to some of the contracts. You know, the procurement decisions that are made out in the private sector, I can say that they are going to be procuring all drugs that are approved by the Food and Drug Administration. So if you go to a private sector pharmacy, they're also going to be buying from the drugs that are approved by the Food and Drug Administration for sale in the country.
Okay. Part of the compliance with Buy America requires that there's standardization across the VA when procurement officials are purchasing supplies. The long-term solution to this supply chain modernization, but as we all know, that has had fits and starts for years. What are you currently doing to push these requirements out to the VISNs and medical centers to ensure compliance with the Buy American laws?
Thank you for the question. Some of the things that we're doing in 24, some of what we're going to do is really identify those, because we know who the clinicians are. The clinicians come up with the requirements from the standpoint of what they need to support a patient. But then you get to that next step of the acquisition life cycle, which is someone has to put that together so it gets over to the contracting office, and the contracting office finally do a contract execution. So all of these things kind of have to be happening lockstep, and what we're doing in VA in 24 is bringing the right people to the table so everybody kind of understands. It's just like this morning we were talking about something and a comment came up around market research. Market research a lot of times is thought about once the package gets over to the contracting officer. It's too late to think about market research when the package gets to the contracting officer, because the market research should be done before you finalize your requirements development. So it's all of these various types of things that we just need to bring the right people, bring them together in a way so that we can push forward some of these things that are very, very important in VA as it relates to healthcare of veterans it is always very important, and it doesn't matter, whether it's one veteran or 10.
Okay. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan. The chair now recognizes Ms. Radewagen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Centineo, in remarks you recently gave during Make PPE in America Industry Day, you discussed challenges VA faces acquiring domestically sourced PPE and noted industry's issues domestically producing PPE. You also indicated VA was working to identify domestically produced PPE. Can you explain VA's process for identifying domestic PPE sources?
Yes, thank you for that question. So as was mentioned, in April, we met with our industry partners and with our federal partners in the initiative for 100% Make PPE in America. Since that time, we have held not only our medical surgical prime vendor industry opportunities. Again, I mentioned earlier, we have our bi-weekly engagements with industry. We actually met, it was mentioned earlier, AWIS, the Acquisition Workforce Innovation Symposium, where industry was there. So we engaged at all of these opportunities, and we continue to reach out and have outreaches. We have had outreach prior to that April timeframe for our medical surgical efforts, but this has actually hyper-focused us on where we need to be with industry and working for industry. But again, the industry feedback to us is we will provide you the products. We have to make sure that the demand signal is there. It goes right back to the conversation of the earlier remarks of this is a decades-long challenge that we have where everyone is in the same space for the same products. And the challenge is that much of it has been overseas. So we have to work with industry a little bit more closely, and we continue to do that on our outreaches continually through multimedia.
Has VA entered into any PPE procurement contracts since the law was enacted? And if so, what percentage of these contracts are compliant with the Make PPE in America Act?
So for our medical surgical prime vendor program, we do not have contracts. We have blanket purchase agreements. Those are pricing agreements, and those pricing agreements are established through a solicitation that is actually done through tiered evaluation to be able to get to the vendor that can provide us those items at the best price and cost for the VA. Oftentimes those are service-disabled veteran-owned businesses, but then we place our orders through what's called a prime vendor distributor or distribution contract. So our orders are placed to the distributor. Those distributors actually go to those suppliers to actually source the material. So they're not contracts, they're pricing agreements, and our contracts are through our prime vendor sourcing distribution contracts.
And I'm sorry, ma'am, if it, just to also add to that is part of the compliance for Made in America, those distributors, like on the construction side, they have to self-certify that they are compliant with the Made in America products. And so that's something we do. I will also add that, as you're aware, there's an IVV law or bill that's being processed through the staff and through your areas, and we're not waiting on that. We're actually creating an IVV process ourselves, and it's going to be used to focus on some of these self-certifications to do the independent validation and verification of items. So it's a long-term process, but we anticipate having that in place as part of our because of maturity.
So how does VA ensure that the PPE it purchases from its vendors is Make PPE in America compliant?
Well, that's the certification I mentioned. So the distributors, in part of that MSPV contract was the Made in America compliance that they self-certified, which, if they're fraudulent about that, that's a felony, violating federal certification standards. And then the other part is we need to strengthen that, and that's the independent validation component that I had just mentioned that we're putting in place.
So my staff has met with a number of organizations that manufacture PPE who feel that they're being underutilized by VA. Do you disagree with their conclusions?
I will personally state and just reinforce for all of our industry partners who are watching this and listening to us now that we are looking actively and for you to come to sell to us. As I mentioned in my original oral testimony, a lot of people aren't fully certified, and that's part of the challenge. But we will embrace and we fully want to buy from American manufacturers that are fully compliant. So if they're there and we're not aware of it, I encourage them again, pathfinder.va.gov, to make us aware of it if we don't know who they are.
So does the cost of purchasing domestic PPE ever dissuade VA from looking to work with domestic producers?
I don't think cost is our driver, because we're focusing. One of the changes we're also doing in VA is focusing on best value for major programs. But for commodity type purchases, as Mr. Centennial mentioned, that we're doing purchase agreements that are price structured, and then we buy from there through our distributors. I don't know if you want to add.
Anybody else want to add to it?
The only thing that I would add to that, the preference as it relates to the different pieces of legislation, one of the things that we also did, we have something that well, at the federal level, they have something called a myth buster around some of the issues with buying things. And so we adopted that concept at the VA. And so we recently did a myth buster because one of the issues that came up was, well, we can't, the only thing that we have to do is at VA is look to see if we have 2 veteran-owned companies. But the answer is not that we have 2 veteran-owned companies, because you also, if you're buying PPE, you also have to comply with IIJA. So what we did with the myth busters, we just help people understand what is that decision tree that you have to look at to get to, because in some cases, the veteran-owned company may not have a product that's 100% made in America as well as 100% manufacturer, but there could be another small business or some other company. So the preference in that case, they would have to go to what company can comply with IIJA.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Radewagen. And Ranking Member Mervan, do you have any closing remarks?
I do. Thank you, Chair Giggins. I appreciate the testimony and the answers from our witnesses today. I'd like to reemphasize my support for all that the administration and VA are doing to ensure that we make Buy America a priority. I think Mr. Parrish and the rest of our witnesses have a huge task ahead, but I appreciate their commitment to continue to make this a priority, and I look forward to continuing this oversight, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan, and I just want to thank our witnesses for taking time to educate us today and for prioritizing domestic manufacturing of our pharmaceuticals and medical devices and PPE. It's really an issue of national security, so thank you for continuing to just prioritize that and work on that issue. I ask for unanimous consent that all members shall have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material. Hearing no objection, so ordered. The committee stands adjourned. Thank you.